Good day, everyone, and welcome back to day number 4 of Shared Services and Outsourcing North America Digital Week. My name is Rochelle Hood, and I have the pleasure of serving as SSON's Global Head of Customer Analytics and Research, but it's really been my pleasure to chair the event for the entire week and have a wonderful week of moderating sessions with our speakers. I will walk you through a couple of quick logistics to make sure that you get the most out of this session, and then we're going to jump right into the content. So let me navigate, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, a bit of your audience view screen. On the left-hand side, you see a little welcome note in the Q&A box. You're going to use this for 2 ways. First of all, if you encounter any technical issues, if you have any questions related to the conference as a whole, please put that information in there. We have Ashley joining us today from our London office who will assist you with any of those types of support items. Also, we'd love for you to engage. I think a lot of you are going to have some interesting comments, reflection. Yazdi and I were just reflecting about the first time we read the book and heard about theory of constraints. We'd love to hear those kind of things as well as your questions. Put it in that box. We'll be queuing them up and go ahead and having some dialogue at the end of the content presentation. And then finally on the right-hand side, I just wanted to point out, you see our photos as we're speaking, but underneath that there's buttons to our social media, to LinkedIn. So if you'd like to connect with us directly, if you want to continue to collaborate on this topic or any other topics for me related to the conference as a whole, feel free to use those buttons and keep the conversation going. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Yazdi to the stage. You'll see his full bio if you use the down under arrow underneath his name on the speaker bio. But I just want to say what I find particularly remarkable. He's the Senior Vice President of DBS and Emerging Technologies at Walmart. But he has just wealth of background from retail, huge retail operations that really shape and change the world when you're talking about both Walmart and his previous organization and work at Procter & Gamble. So what an immense resource to see things on a scale and it's a global impact that most people don't have an opportunity to do so. And on that note, Yazdi, let's hear about how we can use the theory of constraints in a shared services environment. Welcome to the digital stage, and now over to you.
Thank you, Rochelle, and good morning to everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is theory of constraints and how you can drive it in the shared service environment. And before I do that, let me talk a little bit about my background and my journey in shared services. As Rochelle mentioned, I am the Senior Vice President of GBS in Walmart. Mainly GBS right now in Walmart is finance, and what we have recently created is another tower, which is digital transformation as a service. So we have a vertical in GBS which looks at intelligent automation opportunities in areas that are even outside the GBS, and machine learning and data science, and we provide that as a service to the rest of Walmart. Before I joined Walmart, and I've been in Walmart for less than a year, I was in Procter & Gamble, where I spent 23 years in various roles in IT and shared services. In fact, I joined P&G in IT. I went through the usual IT roles. I was the CIO of Procter & Gamble India, and then I started doing a few international assignments. I was in Singapore and Philippines and then the US. And while I was in the Philippines, my job was to automate the shared service center that we had out there. And as I was doing that role, I got interested in actually wanting to run a shared service. And luckily, I got the job. And over a period of many years, I ran Procure to Pay for Procter & Gamble. My last role in P&G was I was the Vice President of Consumer Solutions as a vertical. Consumer Solutions is where we look at brand operations, e-commerce operations, IT, and services for Procter & Gamble. And for me, that was a moment of pride because P&G's shared services had matured so much that the company was entrusting the GBS with what was P&G's core function, brand and brand operations. So P&G has been a pretty mature shared services. We've been in the shared service format for maybe 20 years. Comparatively, Walmart is a much younger organization as a shared service. I would say that the size of Walmart is a lot more daunting, but then the amount of transformation that you can do is a big challenge. Just for example, in P&G, I had 5.5 million invoices when I was running payments for Procter & Gamble. In Walmart, that number is more than 200 million invoices. Sometimes we don't even know what the exact number is. And before I joined P&G, I was a management consultant. So that's a little bit of background about me. And now let's jump into theory of constraints. Now, when I usually share the slide and I'm in a live group, I ask people to raise their hands, those who've read theory of constraints. And I usually get around between half or 3/4 of a room saying they have read TOC sometime in their career. The Goal, which is the first book of the theory of constraints, was written around 30 years ago in the late 80s. And this book is usually on the list of top 10 management books. Most lists have it. In most places, in many companies, it is compulsory reading. I just learned that Jeff Bezos makes it compulsory reading in Amazon. In a lot of MBA classes, it is compulsory reading. If there's one thing that you should take away from this session is that if you've not read The Goal, you should read it. It's a great book. When I read it in the late 80s, I was completely taken up by it, and I tried a few of these guidelines and theories and practices that Ellie suggested. So the theory of constraints is a very simple thing. What it says is it's a paradigm that looks at any system, and it says that the limitation of that system is only a couple of constraints. So if you look at any system and you want to maximize the goal of the system, you want to optimize the system, you don't try to break that system up into small parts and make each part efficient. You look at the system as a whole and try to find the one or two things that makes it not achieve its goal. And then you just focus on that. So in a way, TOC is a focusing mechanism. It's like a chain. If you want to increase the strength of the chain, you don't need to increase the strength of every link in the chain. You have to find the weakest link and try to improve on that. And that shows you where to focus, and it gives you the best results in the smallest time. So that's what the goal was. The goal really focused on using the theory of constraints practices in manufacturing. And I can say right now that most manufacturing plants in the world, they use the theory of constraints as their mode of working. And if you look at the 5 focusing steps that the goal talked about, it's basically to identify the constraint. So what is the constraint of the system? The next step is to exploit or leverage the constraint. What that means is you make sure that you are focusing on the constraint and it is increasing its output as much as possible. You subordinate everything else to the constraints, means you actually don't focus on other things, but you make sure that everything else in the system is feeding what is the constraint. The next step is you might want to increase the capacity of the constraint, which is what we call elevate the constraint. And then when you find that the constraint is no longer the constraints, you go back to step 1 to find what is the next constraint. So in any system, whether it's a manufacturing system or a retail system or a supply chain system, anywhere where flow is important, even project management where flow is important, the theory of constraints helps you identify how to increase the flow or how to increase the throughput, and I'll explain what throughput is in subsequent slides. It shows you where to focus. And a little bit about the session is more about what we can use from TOC in the shared service environment. So Ellie wrote the goal, and the goal is a very easy read. You probably take around 3 to 4 hours to read it, and it's really a story. So it is one of the management books that you can start and then you want to finish it because it's written in the form of a story. Ellie then wrote a few more books. I said goal was focused on manufacturing. His next book, which was Critical Chain, used the TOC 5-step principles on project management. And then he wrote The Choice, where he used the same principles on retail. And after that, The Haystack Syndrome, where he used the same principles on analytics. The Race, where he used it on the supply chain. And then he wrote It's Not Luck, where he taught us how to use his theory on any system. So how do you look at any ecosystem and how do you find out what are really the constraints of that system? Okay, for project managers, I would suggest that you definitely read Critical Chain. It's a very interesting read. I've been a project manager all my life, and Critical Chain was a book that I practically used in most of my projects. So let me talk about my own personal journey with TOC. As I said, I had read the book in the early 90s, and I liked the book. I tried using some of the concepts as I was a consultant and a project manager. But around 6 years ago, I really got into TOC, and this is how it happened. My CIO at that time in Procter & Gamble, he was very interested in the innovations that were happening in India. What was happening at that time was the Tata company was making a passenger car called the Nano for under $2,000 US. There was a hospital in Bangalore that was giving better treatment for costs that were like 1/10 of the cost that you would get that treatment in the UK or the US, with much better results. There was a mobile company that was able to give large amounts of data at very cheap costs. So there was this thing going around called frugal innovation coming out of India, and my CIO wanted to learn about what are they doing, how are they figuring out what to do. So we took a trip down to India. We spent around a couple of weeks visiting many companies. We visited the Tata company. We visited Bharti Telecom. We visited the hospital. So we visited a few companies. And the theme that was emerging, at least in 8 out of the 10 companies that we visited, was they were using theory of constraints principles. And I was very intrigued. I made a trip to Israel, where Goldratt Consulting is, and I sat down with them to see how I could get this into Procter & Gamble. And my first trial of theory of constraints in P&G was to use it in my projects. So at that time, my job was I owned all the finance, P&G Global Finance IT projects. And I brought theory of constraints in to figure out how I could improve the throughput and flow of my projects and do more projects with the same amount of resources. And we had a few consultants who came in who were masters in theory of constraints, and they looked at our projects and our portfolio. And I would say that within 3 to 4 months, we were doing much better with our projects. We were improving the flow of our projects with TOC concepts, and we were using what is called as critical chain project management, which is the application of TOC in the project world. And as we were doing this, the consultants then started actually looking at the projects and started using TOC for, were these projects even worth doing? So we moved pretty quickly from using TOC to improve the throughput of our projects to looking at our entire portfolio and figuring out whether the projects in our portfolio were really driving the throughput of the system, or were they just improving the symptoms and not the root causes of what was really troubling our system. And as we started looking at projects and figuring out using TOC whether they were worth doing or not, we then started expanding the TOC process into entire services. Can I look at TOC on my ecosystem of procure to pay in P&G and figure out what is it that I need to change and what is my future state? Because whenever you are looking at any service, you are trying to answer 3 questions: what to change to, and how to cause the change. And TOC thinking was giving very good answers, very logical answers to all those 3 questions. So we then started using TOC for more and more services, and I have a few examples of what sort of results that gave us. So what the theory of constraints systems thinking process does is it takes you to a framework of systems thinking where it initially decides, it helps you decide what is the goal of your system and what's the throughput measure of the system. So as we started doing TOC, I was very surprised to find that in many of our services, whether it was payment services or order management services or finance services or tax services, at times it was, the goal was not aligned. So if you right now, even in your companies, go to your service managers and ask, so what is the goal of the service? I would bet that in many companies, you would get different answers from the stakeholders on a particular service. What the TOC thinking drives is it first identifies what is the goal of the service and how is that goal related to the goal of the company. You then go through a process of identifying what are the undesirable effects in your system that prevent us from achieving our goals. And you put that down into a cause and effect diagram. And that is what we call the current reality tree, which is on the top left corner of this slide. Now, identifying the goal, putting together the current reality tree, as you do that, you will identify at the bottom of the current reality tree 1 or 2 constraints that is really impacting the system from driving throughput for the company. And as you do that, you then analyze the constraints and figure out what are the core conflicts and what are the injections that you can do to break that conflict. Now, this diagram might look extremely complicated, but it's not. It's really not, because once you do the cause and effect and you find the core conflicts and you find what is it that you have to do to break the conflict, the rest of the diagram is really basic project management, because you now know the direction of the solution. You first try to figure out whether that solution is really going to solve the conflict or is it going to make it worse, and that's what we call the future reality tree. We then try to figure out what are the requisites for us to achieve the solution, which is really a prerequisite tree. It's like a work breakdown structure in a project plan. And then based on all of these prerequisites, we have a transition tree, which is nothing but a project plan. So even though this diagram looks very complicated for most project managers, the first part is the discovery of what really is it that we need to change. And the rest of the diagram is just basic project management, clearly determining if there are any other undesirable effects that the solution will cause and how to plan for those, the work breakdown structure, and then the project plan. So with that, let me give a few examples of how this worked out in reality. Okay, so here's the way we represent a basic activity system in theory of constraints. You identify the goal, and then what's the input, what's the transformation that you do, what's the output, and then what are the control mechanisms you have in the system to make sure that everything is running smoothly. And then you have something called the throughput. So the goal of the system is what the system wants to achieve. The throughput is the connection between the goal of the system and the goal of the company. So the goal of any company is to make more money now and in the future. That's really the goal of any company. Okay, unless it's a non-profit, you want to make more money now and in the future. Throughput is the rate at which the current system that you're evaluating helps the company make more money now and in the future. So it connects your service to the revenue stream of the company. Okay, so let me give you a few examples of that. Okay, so my first example, which is my favorite example of all time, is the global procure-to-pay example. The story behind this is my GBS president I had just taken over global procure-to-pay, and my GBS president asked me, hey, can you save $20 million from the operating cost of procure-to-pay? We used to spend around $200 to $300 million on the procure-to-pay operations, and can you save 10%? And we started doing the systems thinking, and we figured out that, instead of saving $20 million in operating cost, you could actually save $400 million in throughput or actual revenue streams for the company. And here's how we came about it, right? If you look at what is the connection of procure-to-pay to the revenue stream of the company, you figure out that if you do the job in a certain way, you can really help your sourcing buyers negotiate better with your suppliers. So if you looked at our average rate at which we made our invoices ready to pay, it was 15 days. And after 15 days, even though our payment terms were 60 days or 75 days, after 15 days, a supplier could come to the company and get the payment at a discounted rate. And as we did the analysis, we realized that if we could change that 15 days to 2 days, that would drive a lot of throughput for the company, because we could get a lot of, we had much more negotiating power. We could pay at a discounted rate. We did our calculations. We were spending around X billion dollars on our goods. If we were able to do this, and even half the suppliers took that discounted rate and gave us that money back, we would save $400 million. So now the goal of our system became, how do we make sure that we pay in 2 days, make the invoices ready to pay in 2 days instead of our current 15 days. And that changed the way we looked at our portfolio. So once we did the analysis of what are the constraints that are preventing us from making our invoices ready to pay in 2 days, you came down to, there were around 2 or 3 constraints. The first constraint was really a policy constraint. So what would happen if an invoice was blocked for payment? The GBS would not have the authority to unblock that invoice. They had to send that invoice to a buyer who looked after that supplier, and the buyer had the authority to say, yes, what the supplier is asking for is the right price or not. And what we actually found was the buyers were really not interested in getting into this, because if there is a price discrepancy of $20 or $30, the buyer has a lot more interesting work to do. He was working on $1 million deals, so they would actually just say yes to those emails or to those workflow items. So we went back to the company and said, can we change the policy instead of us asking the buyers to say yes or no for every price block? Why can't GBS make that determination, especially if we go and check the contract and make sure that the price that the supplier is asking is as per the contract? And yes, we had to increase 2 or 3 FTE because now we were doing that work, but actually we saved a lot of effort in the follow-ups that we were doing with the buyers. This really reduced the cycle time for a lot of our price block invoices. And this alone, just by making this change, we went from 15 days to 10 days average time. The next constraint was we were working with an outsourcing company who was scanning our invoices and then putting it into SAP. And that contract was around 10 years old. And they had started using OCR. And even though they were sort of able to do it faster, the contract had not been changed. So they were not really reducing the cycle time. So we went to them, we paid them a little bit of extra money, and we changed the contract so that the cycle time of getting the invoice to putting it into our SAP system reduced. And that reduced our total cycle time from 10 days then to 7 days. We really never reached 2 days. We sort of came down to around 4 days average invoice ready to pay. But as a result, we were able to discount our invoices much earlier. And as a result, we could drive a lot more throughput to the company than just the 20 million in operating costs. The key thing to note out here is that where we contributed to the revenue stream of the company, because when you do that, you always make your process frictionless, you always tend to reduce your cycle time. Operating costs do come out of the system. So you do, and when you focus on throughput, most of the times, you also reduce your operating costs. So this was quite a bit of a success story in Procter & Gamble, and we started looking at can we do this thinking in other services? Can we focus on truly the revenue stream of the company instead of focusing only on operating costs? The next example was when we did the same thing in banking, and I wouldn't get into a lot more details out here, but the most important thing I wanted to highlight in this example is that when we did our workshop on banking, they spent a lot of time just talking about what is the goal and what's the throughput value of the banking shared service. And it was eye-opening for me because there were around 15 people in the room in the workshop. The average experience of that in that room was every person had 20 to 25 years of banking experience in a company. But overall, the goals were completely not aligned. We spent a lot of time discussing what's the goal of the service along with our stakeholders, and then what is the throughput value? How does the banking system impact whatever is the revenue stream of the company? And I was surprised because I thought with banking it would have been a lot easier, but it wasn't. So initially when we did this workshop, the throughput was interest. Hey, if we do our cash movement correctly, we can earn more interest for the company. And I think what we finally settled on was working cash. If we do our banking and cash movement correctly, you will have more working cash. That working cash I can use to get interest, or that is the working cash that I can use to pay my suppliers so that I don't have to pay a discount. So stuff like that. And once we had identified the goal and the throughput of the system, once again, we were able to quickly hone in on what are the 1 or 2 constraints that prevent us from maximizing the throughput and really driving value for the company. So when I usually have a presentation on theory of constraints, folks say, hey, but then what's the difference between Lean and Six Sigma and TOC, and is this competing? Is it similar? And here's how I usually respond. I've spent a lot of years in the shared service. I've done a lot of value stream workshops. I've done a lot of fishbone diagrams and DMAIC work. And I think these are all very connected. I think what TOC does is it helps you really connect your service to the revenue stream of the company, and it tells you where to look at a very high level. There is a place for Lean and Six Sigma too. I'm a big believer in Six Sigma's DMAIC format and the quality that it generates. I'm a big believer in Lean and the flow thinking it generates. The issue that I see is after a value stream management workshop or after a Lean workshop or a Six Sigma workshop, you usually come out with a lot of projects. You come out with 30, 40 projects, and then you put those projects on a fit, feasibility, and attractiveness metrics, and you figure out which are the projects that you will do now and which are the projects that you will do next year in a continuous improvement style. Sometimes that I find that some of the projects that you do will save a couple of hours here and a couple of hours there, but does not have an impact on the total cycle time of the process. It actually at times might even be pushing the work across. Now, obviously, if you have a very good Lean and Six Sigma facilitator, you won't allow that to happen, but many times it does. And my thought is, wouldn't you rather work on 2 or 3 big projects with the biggest impact to the revenue stream of the company than work on 30 to 40 projects which really impact the number of hours that people are spending on the work? So, and there are other basic differences. For example, Lean thinks of idle time as a waste. In many cases in TOC, we don't think of idle time as a waste, because you might be idle because you are actually trying not to create inventory which stacks up in front of a constraint. Because if you do that, actually you're putting more pressure on the constraint. So there are lots of other slight differences. What I find is that I use TOC when I'm looking at a full system, and then when I'm looking at part of a process, I might do a Lean workshop. But even as I'm doing Lean workshops right now in certain parts of my service in Walmart, I find that the number of projects that come out are just too many, and sometimes they don't have as much impact as the projects that come out of a TOC facilitation. So what are my top 3 key takeaways from this session? Here's what I would suggest. I would suggest considering doing a systems thinking workshop for your services in your GBS. Start thinking of throughput as a key metrics for the service. That is, how does your service truly impact the revenue stream of the company? And you will find that all services do impact the revenue stream of the company. Even something like record to report, which seems like something you have to do for closing the books and reporting to the SECC. If you truly think about it, that process really does impact the revenue stream of the company. And build your service portfolio based on what drives throughput, because if you focus on throughput, you get more value for the company. You focus on throughput, you do get cost reduction because you make your process frictionless. You focus on things other than your process. You focus on the process, the organization, the policies, the ways of working, the measures. You look at everything holistically instead of just focusing on the process. So that's all I had. We have quite a few minutes for questions. So I'm open to questions, and I think, Rochelle, you will be coordinating that for us.
I will certainly do that. Some questions are already coming in, and while I am facilitating questions with Yasti, I decided that it would be fun to actually do a poll to hear from all of you about the goal book. Now that you've heard a lot about it, I was conversing with a couple of you in the chat, but we'd like to have all of you do this. Go ahead and put up, if you've read the book, what was the year that you read it, if you remember that, or approximate time frame, and the context. Was it an MBA program? You were getting your PMP for certified project managers? Is it just, a friend recommended this, a colleague, that type of thing? So go ahead and interact with us by putting some comments in there. First question, as you were talking on your procure to pay example about one of the outcomes of that was paying invoices sooner. So there's a comment like, how is that better? Why would you want to do that rather than saving the cash? I can think of an obvious answer of taking advantage of discounts and those kind of things, but are there other things that, so it's not just avoiding paying late, but what else would be the result of wanting to pay invoices sooner besides discounts?
I probably didn't explain that. So it's not that we pay early. We just make the invoices ready to pay early. We pay at 75 days or 60 days, whatever is the payment term. But it allows the supplier to come in and take the money early at a discounted rate if they want, or we tie up with banks and the payment is given to the supplier by the bank, and they charge the suppliers for it. So for us, it's a win for everyone. We still pay after the 75 days. The suppliers are very happy because they are able to get the cash early if they want at a discounted rate, and we get that benefit. So, it helps in the negotiations. For big companies, the ability to make an invoice ready to pay early is a huge negotiation driver for the sourcing buyers. So we don't pay early. Why would we pay that early? That would impact our cash flow. So I'm glad someone asked that question because that clarified it.
Yeah, and thank you. And Vyasi, I hadn't thought of this before when you were saying that, but probably another unexpected benefit of that is that, if everything is ready to pay in the system, any type of self-service portals like vendor management portals and stuff would reflect that so much earlier, meaning obviously with dynamic discounting and everything, it would probably reduce phone calls and follow-ups because people can already go in and see it's ready to pay, and I can either choose the discounts or not. Because much later than that, then you're going to get a flood of phone calls and emails and stuff saying, when am I going to get paid? When am I going to pay? Is it ready to be paid? So it probably has helped with the flow of requests or inquiries or the impact or strength of your self-service vendor management portals as well. Would you say that that is true?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. It does happen. You find that if you have something like 15 days ready to pay, you will start getting calls after 10 days. Because you remember, 15 days is an average, right? There are some invoices that will be made ready to pay in 7 days, some in 30. Obviously, the one which are ready to pay in 30 days, which has taken more time to unblock, those calls will come 3-4 times before it's up on the shared service, up on the self-service portal. If you try to make an average of 2 days, so if you reduce that average, those number of calls will go down. That's absolutely true. Fantastic.
All right, well, keep those questions coming in. A couple things that I would like to ask you as more questions are coming in as well. As a certified project manager myself, I'm very interested. You've done a great parallel with how theory of constraint is used with Lean Six Sigma methodologies and quality methodologies. We have several people writing in saying that they learned it, that they studied it when they were getting their black belts or were getting green belts. What would you say in relation to how this works with Agile? I mean, most of us are trying to look at Agile development both on process sides as well as project for software development and those types of things. But, that's a whole different approach because you haven't really understood a lot of what your constraints might be because of that rapid development. You only get to a certain level and move on. So with such a strong background in IT, I am curious about what you think about the effectiveness or how theory of constraints can be applied when you use Agile methodology.
Oh, I wish I had $1 for every time I've been asked that question. So here's how I really think about it. I look at my career and I just think of myself as a project manager who's working in different areas, either it's IT or it's business projects or in shared service projects. That's how I really think of my competency. First of all, you cannot use Agile for every project. when you're building a building or when you're doing a business change management project, you can have the agile mindset, but you really can't use a Scrum or an Agile. So I would say that if there is a project, which is an IT development project, which is where you can develop and you don't need a fixed scope, and then you can get very rapid feedback from your business, and you can work with the business engaged in a Scrum mindset, Agile is what you need to use. It is much more powerful than anything else. But I have seen many examples where people try use Agile, where really you have to use waterfall, okay, where you need to have a fixed scope, where you are working in a system which doesn't allow you to make mistakes, okay, like finance systems, a tax systems. You have to use waterfall in those. You can use the Agile mindset, but you have to use the waterfall life cycle. And even right now in my area, I think it's 50-50. There are 50% of the projects where I think Agile really fits well as a life cycle. And if it does, you should use Agile. The other 50%, you really are stuck with the waterfall life cycle.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, go ahead.
And in that waterfall life cycle, you should actually use CCPM. And then CCPM and Agile have a lot of similarities because both of those methods really try to focus on the flow and the deliverable of the project rather than the tasks. So they're both very holistic life cycles. There are lots of similarities, but if you can use Agile, you should use Agile.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And if you do, we'll start putting those little dollars in the piggy bank since we all asked you that question one more time. Here's the next question. It relates to integration of technology. This week we have had so many sessions where discussions have come up about process mining. Some people still refer to elements of that as process discovery or process intelligence, but many of the process mining tools, while they don't refer to it as theory of constraints, it's often called bottlenecks. From that perspective, they systematically go through and follow a task through a process and then begin to show where I call it the spaghetti diagram, where it keeps going back in continuous loop or it errors out and exceptions out each time. Have you experienced, do you guys use any process mining tools? Have you added the concepts or other learnings about what to do after you identify those bottlenecks in the constraints to apply theories of constraints to that? Or do you have any advice for folks who might be looking at implementing those types of tools and how this thinking and methodology can be brought into that using those tools?
Yeah, so we've started using process mining tools, and I mean, in many cases they work very, very well. In many cases they don't. It depends on how easy is it for your systems to connect to the process mining. I mean, if you're a complete SAP shop and a few ERPs, it is much easier. Otherwise, it's much more difficult. I think process mining is an excellent way of figuring out where your processes are slowing down and what are your exceptions that are really working as outliers to make your average cycle time increase. So I think it's the next big thing because it tells you where to focus your RPA or where to work on removing your bottlenecks. The issue that I see in process mining, once again, is it focuses on the process. Whilst if you do a systems thinking workshop, you find that at times what is impacting your goals and your throughput are outside the purview of your process. You have metrics that are wrong, or you have mindsets or behaviors or organization structures that are structured not optimally. So I would still do a systems thinking workshop to come out of the process and see every aspect of the ecosystem that is impacting your service. But at some point, instead of doing a value stream mapping exercise in a workshop environment with whiteboards and yellow stickies, I would want to move to process mining because that is a digital twin for your process, and you'll get to the really much faster.
All right, thank you. I'm going to then continue on the idea, the concept about doing the system thinking workshops. We also, and you may have had an opportunity to sit in a couple of sessions while you were presenting in Orlando, we did a couple of workshops on design thinking. And I would like your input on if someone is approaching a systems thinking workshop to understand, the constraints, and how this affects overall throughput. And then you move into that phase that you had on the very first chart of saying, now I've learned what I need to understand, and now I need to design something differently. Do you think that that's an interesting integration? Have you possibly done that or considered bringing design thinking in at that stage to help people get out of what they've known for so long and create something completely innovative or different once they've been dealing with all that data and what they've learned from that? How do you think the two of them connect together, or do you think that they don't, or have you actually tried that?
They do. And I do have at least a couple of facilitators who have started using both. So they start with theory of constraints to focus on what are the key opportunities that we need to look at. And then they, instead of going through the theory of constraints framework to figure out, hey, if we do this, then what are the undesirable effects, then what is, they then go into design thinking for the solutioning. And the advantage of going into design thinking for solutioning is you really map out the end user journey. And I think you get a lot more engagement from the folks who are actually going to be users of the system. So I think design thinking is fabulous for when you know what you want to do and what you want to focus on. I don't think design thinking is very robust in the problem that you're trying to solve and connecting your service to what's the revenue stream of the company. I think you focus so much on the user at that point, but you've not started from why are we doing this service in the first place and what is preventing me from really driving value. Now, once again, people might disagree with me. Some people might say, but a really good design thinking facilitator would start with that. I've just not seen that.
All right, thank you. It sounded like some good input on the way that those could work together if you choose, and also the strengths of each one of those methodologies on understanding, how it ties to the business problem, the overall revenue, but also the way in which you're solving the problem. So thanks for that. Jonathan has sent in an interesting question. He wants to know if you can give some advice on how to get more information on what actually constitutes a systems thinking workshop, what elements are there, and how to put one together. And then the second part of his question, can you elaborate more on your notion of throughput? It seems like the definition from theory of constraints is slightly different from the lean approach when looking at throughput. So two separate questions, if you can address those.
So the first question is, you can email me and I can send you a few facilitators who are good at systems thinking workshops using the TOC framework. There are many approaches to doing systems thinking. When I was a consultant, I learned a few. And I just find that the TOC framework is a lot more complete, so I have sort of gravitated towards it. Or you could just Google theory of constraint systems thinking process consultants, and you will find a few folks who are masters at that, and it's not expensive. It would be as expensive as you would get a lean consultant for a week, so it's probably in the same price range. I think TOC does define throughput differently, and I'm not a huge lean expert, but my understanding of how lean defines flow is really from a cycle time point of view. So if I'm looking at a cycle time and want to improve the flow to reduce the cycle time, that's how lean defines it. TOC really focuses on throughput is the rate at which you impact the revenue stream of the company. So what will I do in the system that improves the rate at which, the velocity at which I make more money for the company now and in the future? So in the case of P2P, it is if I increase the percentage of invoices that I have which are ready to pay in 2 days, I am able to impact the revenue stream of the company. So it does require a bit of thinking, because in the shared service environment, we have been so used to looking at ourselves as a back office that sometimes we think of ourselves as very far removed from the revenue stream of the company. But if you are doing a process, there has to be some impact to the revenue stream or the risk or something that is, you're doing the process for a reason other than saving costs. So TOC actually forces you to make that connection and then forces you to find the constraints that help you maximize that connection to the revenue stream.
Well, that is a perfect analogy because I think one thing that we're all working on is raising ourselves up the value chain or demonstrating the way in which we have, and making that direct correlation that you just discussed on applying that theory of constraints approach to always look for how am I contributing to revenue, reducing risk, or something that is at a strategic alignment with the organization is the language and is the process that will help us continue to reinforce that that's the space that Global Shared Services would like to be in. We are getting close to being out of time, so Ghazi, I just want to give you a chance to have any closing reflections. You have used this for a number of years, but really in particular, now that you're in the shared services role, what do you think has been the biggest aha moment for folks? A lot of people have different other methodologies, other way of approaching things, but what do you think in particular is so significant about this approach when applying it to business processes? The reason I'm asking that is also as a lean practitioner myself, for many years people kept saying, it doesn't apply to us, that's about manufacturing. I can't think of how we would use that in business processes. And people probably felt the same about theory of constraints for a long time, and yet you might not physically see it because it's not a widget coming out of a manufacturing process, but we all live this every day, and we visualize it in different ways. So of all of your experience that you have coming from IT and the other backgrounds, but really now being on this side, I'd love to hear what you think is the significance of impact for shared services, and any fun reflections on an aha moment. Have you shared this methodology across the organization of how this has really brought things to light within Walmart or any point in your career?
I think the number one thing that I would say is it is a very, very good tool to align all the stakeholders of your service and the people running your service into, hey, this is why we are doing this work. So it's a great alignment and engagement tool when you go through a theory of constraints workshop, because you then align on a goal, you align on why we are doing this service, and then you align on the big ticket items that everyone has to work towards. So as I came into Walmart, within the first month, I got my favorite theory of constraints facilitators in, and first I trained my direct reports. I didn't make it compulsory, but the moment you go through the training, you realize that, hey, we have to change our mindset because we focus too much on costs, and this really helps us understand that we have a higher purpose. So it raises the energy of your shared service team. We were getting a lot of projects to be done to improve our shared services, which were actually coming from our stakeholders, and they were all solution-based. So, for example, in record to report, hey, why can't we use Blackline to improve our intercompany because the business needs it? And the moment you start doing your theory of constraints thinking, you realize that Blackline is not going to solve any problem. You really have to go down to the root cause and figure out whether you've got the right data in the system and there is a governance issue that you have to solve, because if you put black line on a bad master data, you're actually going to create more problems. So we've stopped a lot of noise, and our portfolio has become extremely streamlined into just 3 or 4 big projects where everyone's aligned on and everyone's holding hands. So it actually is a very good tool to give a sense of purpose, a vision, a strategy, and a very strong but a small portfolio in your shared service. So my experience with P&G was, it was trial and error. We were working our way through it. We were figuring out how to sell this idea. But after 6 or 7 years of doing that, as I came into Walmart, I sort of had a framework of how to work on this thing, and it's working pretty well. I think my chief controller, my tax president, the folks who are in FP&A, they all participate in these workshops. They all feel this is a great use of their time, because it's aligning them on a strategic vision on what finance processes are really doing for the company and how do we take finance to the next level. So it's working pretty well.
Well, congratulations on all of that, and certainly just with the benefit of getting everyone aligned on, the goals, getting the stakeholders along with what services you're delivering and why is an achievement in itself, much less all the results that come out of those workshops. So, Yazdi, this has been absolutely wonderful. It took me back memory lane, as I think it did many of the people who were writing in comments. But there were black belts, there were green belts, there were people that read this in their MBA. So you've really brought us back to some interesting times throughout our career and what the impact was. I love the way that you've applied this in the shared services environment. Thank you for giving us your time today and the wisdom and experience that you've had from both Procter & Gamble and Walmart. Thanks to all of you who have listened to this live. A special thank you as well to those of you who are listening to the on-demand recording version of this. A few more quick announcements before we sign off. As a reminder, tomorrow you'll be receiving a link to the recording of this so you can listen to it again. And one tip that I usually say with that is, for all the leaders that are on the line, do consider this as some training for your lunch and learn sessions, if you've got a town hall, if you're working on some type of leadership development or mentoring. These are the ways, and that's one of the benefits of digital, is that you can take that with you and share that later on. Also, take the conversation forward. Yazdi would love to speak to you, so use those buttons underneath his name to connect with him on LinkedIn or via email for any other questions that come up, or to bounce this off or talk about 30 constraint. I'm sure he could talk about it all day and would really enjoy them. And then next, let me just announce our next 2 sessions of the day today. Coming up in just 30 minutes at 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, we are going to have a really cool analytics session. This is called Analyzing the Super Bowl from the Shared Services Replay booth, with an organization that actually offers data analytics and uses it to help people understand that in order to cash, procure, to pay, and so much else. So that's going to be a fun, interactive discussion on the analytics and how you use that and how you can develop that competency in your own centers. And then a powerhouse closeout to the day, Debbie Ballard from McDonald's talks about the complete transformation of their GBS from the inside out, some tips that go all the way back to insights from their original founder that you're going to hear in that session. And then immediately following Debbie's presentation, I'm going to give some chairwoman remarks, just giving some reflections on the entire week and a couple insights that I felt were impactful. So we hope to see you back in 30 minutes. Yazdi, thanks for your time today. I hope you had an enjoyable time with us as well.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. And this now concludes the webinar session.